Putin is not our friend. Putin is not a defender of Western civilization. In fact, Putin is a villain who is working in close partnership with the villains in the West to bring humanity under this one-world totalitarian system. All right, guys. Hey, wonderful to have you here. Thank you for coming. And so we're all going to talk about Putin. I have one particular angle that I want to spend most of my time on, and that is the role that Putin is playing in the New World Order. Now, there's this impression given that Putin and the establishment in the Western world are at odds with each other and always have been, but I think there's much more to the story than we're being told. And I believe that Putin has been a key player in the agenda to build a new world order, and almost certainly still is. Now, when you're dealing with these kinds of people like Putin, we need to remember that they're worse than any gangsters you can imagine. And when mafia bosses do drive-bys, at least they have some moral code. They don't kill each other's wives and children typically. Not so with the international elite. They have a code of morals that is basically non-existent. And so it's entirely possible, I suppose, that Putin has betrayed them. These types of people often betray each other. Of Stalin's top 34 deputies, I think 4 actually died a natural death. So it's not unusual for mass murderers and monsters to turn on each other. And so it is possible, I suppose, that Putin has changed his allegiance. But I think the evidence will show very clearly that Putin has been working toward this New World Order agenda for a very long time. And we can start off by saying he ought to be getting an award from NATO as NATO Salesman of the Year, right? For decades, for generations, Western leaders have tried to get the Swedes and the Finns and others to join NATO, and they have consistently refused. Now suddenly they are in line to get inside of NATO, which of course is a UN military arm, not a true defender of the West as it was marketed. We know also that Klaus Schwab has called Putin one of his young global leaders. Just a little bit suspicious. And of course, Putin and Henry Kissinger are like two peas in a pod, so I'll come back to that. Now, it's true that Putin makes himself out to be a Christian, and he does speak out against transgenderism and LGBT agenda and abortion and these things like this. He's also freed up homeschooling somewhat, and just today the news came that his government would be withdrawing from the World Health Organization and the World Trade Organization. And so we as conservatives in America look at that and say, wow, that's better than some Western leaders, right? Western leaders are cracking down on homeschooling. They're pushing LGBTism on the population. They're promoting abortion. They're openly hostile to Christianity. And on the surface, at least, Putin is not doing those things. In fact, he almost seems rather friendly to Christianity. And I think a lot of Western conservatives they've just become so desperate for somebody on the international stage that they can identify with, somebody who represents their values, that they have been deceived into believing that Putin is such a man. I do not believe that he is. Now, I can't judge his relationship with his God. That's between him and the Lord. I can't tell you whether he's a true Christian or not. That's, of course, in God's purview. But the Bible does tell us that by their fruits ye shall know them. And we can judge people and what they do based on what they're doing. And if you look at Putin and the things that he promotes, what you find is a very, very sinister agenda. Of course, communist ideology and the people who have been promoting it, if you can even call it that, have murdered more than 100 million people. They've enslaved billions over the last century. And yet somehow Vladimir Putin publicly claimed that Christianity and communism are very similar. That's a pretty bizarre remark if you ask me. As a Christian, I would say that communism and Christianity are essentially opposites, and yet this was widely reported in the international media. Putin claimed that the ideology of communism could be found throughout the Bible, which, I'd like to know which chapter and verse you find communism in. Putin also likened the mass-murdering dictator Vladimir Lenin and his dead body lying in Moscow's Red Square to the veneration of Christian saints. So here's exactly what Putin said. He said, communist ideology is very similar to Christianity, in fact. Freedom, equality, brotherhood, justice, everything is laid out in the Holy Scripture. It's all there. And frankly, I find that offensive. Right? It's true that Christianity does advocate for those things, and it's true that the Bible proposes freedom and equality and brotherhood and justice. But I'd like to know where exactly in communist ideology you find anything more than lip service to those things. Now, in a Russian documentary called Valam, part of this was aired on Kremlin-owned propaganda outlets, Putin said, in the code of the builder of communism, this is sublimation. It's just such a primitive excerpt from the Bible. Nothing new was invented. Now, Putin said that during those years of militant atheism, priests were eradicated and churches were destroyed and a new religion was being created. And that is, in a sense, true. But the idea that Putin could possibly truly believe that Christianity and communism are similar, are close to each other, are in any way cousins is frankly preposterous. But when you learn a little bit about what has happened to the Russian Orthodox Church, you see where he might be getting these ideas from. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church, of course, early on during the Soviet era was ruthlessly persecuted. The priests were butchered, tortured, the church buildings were destroyed, parishioners were thrown into gulags, and just like always happens when the church is being persecuted, the church went underground, and of course it grew, and the church was able to continue to operate even though it was being ruthlessly persecuted. And after a while, the Soviets decided, hey, maybe we'd be better off just trying to hijack it. And so officially they started tolerating the Russian Orthodox Church. But when you look at the leadership, what you find is these are all people coming out of the KGB. In 2009, Vladimir Mikhailovich Gundayev, today he's known as Metropolitan Kirill, he was chosen to serve as the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia. That's the highest position of authority within the Russian Orthodox Church. And what they didn't report very much was that he was also a KGB agent. Pretty interesting. So were both of the two leading competitors to take that job. All three of them were KGB agents. Not just KGB informants, but actual KGB agents. His wealth, Patriarch Kirill's personal wealth, has been estimated in 2006 by Moscow News at $4 billion. Now, that kind of Christianity does strike me as kind of similar to communism. The communist barbarians, they love to talk about justice and equality and how we need to serve the poor, and then they run around with yachts and other things like this. Now, the Metropolitan Kirill, of course, has been a key player in a number of organizations, including the World Council of Churches, and this has been a key apparatus for exporting this fraudulent version of Christianity around the world. And I think that explains a lot about where Putin got these kinds of ideas about Christianity and communism. Now, what has Putin been doing when it comes to other denominations of Christians? Well, we know he has been ruthlessly persecuting other denominations of Christians, Protestants, evangelicals, even organizations like the Jehovah's Witnesses. Their people have been thrown in jail. There have been laws passed forbidding evangelism outside of church walls. Missionaries now need special permits to be able to go and preach the gospel, and all sorts of other draconian restrictions have been imposed on churches other than the Russian Orthodox Church. And Christians have been speaking out. Actually, Russia's Baptist Council of Churches wrote in a letter that this new religion regime would, and I'm quoting here, create conditions for the repression of all Christians. Any person who mentions their religious view or reflections out loud or puts them in writing without the relevant documents could be accused of illegal missionary activity. Okay, this is all from the open letter from the Baptist Council. In an open letter to Putin, the head of all the Protestant churches in Russia, he actually warned that this was Sovietesque. He said, Soviet history has shown us how many people of different faiths have been persecuted for spreading the word of God. This law brings us back to that shameful past. And so, when Putin talks about Christianity being similar to communism, I think we need to recognize that he's not talking about the Christianity that we read about in the Bible. He's not talking about the Christianity of the apostles, and he's not even talking about the Christianity of the modern church today. He's really talking about a new fraudulent Christianity that has been hijacked. Now, that's not to say that every member of the Russian Orthodox Church has been deceived by these lies. It's not my place to argue that. But what we do know is that some of the doctrines that they're pushing internationally, we know that their leadership comes from the KGB, and we know that they are teaching things and persecuting other Christians that regular, true Christians would never do. Now, the communists in Russia thought that this was absolutely fantastic. One of the communist leaders, the deputy chairman of the Duma, Ivan Melnikov, he's actually the vice chairman of the Communist Party, he says, I think these words of the president very effectively and reasonably smooth out the acute angles around the theme of the mausoleum. That's where Putin was talking about Lenin as a saint to be venerated. He says, communists and all leftist patriotic forces in Russia understand that communism is close to Christianity as much as the form of capitalism that exists in our country and our economy today is far from Christianity. So the communists seem to have taken a different approach to Christianity than they did early on during the early years of the Soviet Union. Now, a lot of people around the world ridiculed these comments, but I think they're very revealing about the real Putin that we're dealing with, right? If you actually look at communism, if you look at Marxism, what you'll find is that it is the opposite of Christianity. In fact, on almost all of the key points, Marx taught the opposite of Christianity. So God ordained family. Marxism teaches that we should eradicate the family. God ordained private property. Marxism teaches that we should eradicate private property. And of course, Marx was a ridiculous opponent of all things having to do with the Bible, the church, and even religion. Now, Marx claimed to be an atheist, just like a lot of the communist leaders did, but there's a very compelling book written by a man who was in prison in a Romanian gulag for years. The book is called Marx and Satan. It was written by Pastor Richard Wurmbrandt, and the book makes a very compelling case that Marx was not actually an atheist. He was, in the truest sense of the term, a Satanist. And not just Marx, but many other communist leaders around the world. And he actually says that there's evidence that they were involved in satanic rituals, and that and one of the things that he brought in that I thought was so interesting was the poetry of Karl Marx. There are actual poems written by Karl Marx where he positively refers to Satan. He talks about a deal that he had with Satan, and pretty amazing. And it just made me think of Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20. Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil. Right? Communism is evil in the truest sense of the term, and that needs to be clearly understood. Now, it's not just the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church that comes out of the KGB. Putin himself comes out of the KGB, and so do his top deputies. In fact, he's appointed more KGB and FSB leaders to senior positions in government than at any time since the fall, or the official fall at least, of the Soviet Union, at any time in the history of the Russian Federation. According to the BBC and other news agencies, more than 80% of Putin's appointees came from the security and intelligence agencies, just like Putin himself. Now, Putin is a creature of the KGB. And of course, the KGB is one of the most diabolical organizations that have ever existed in human history. The torture, the methodologies that they use to break their opponents are so mind-bogglingly evil. You struggle to find that kind of savagery anywhere in human history outside of the communist dictatorships that were being trained by the KGB to do these types of things. Now, we also know that under Putin's leadership in the KGB and then later in the government, the Russian government has been carrying out false flag attacks. That is not the mark of somebody who would be considered a friend. Right? The topic of this conference is Putin, friend or foe. And if you're involved in carrying out false flag attacks, I would say pretty clearly you're not a friend and you don't have moral principles. Now, a lot of this was documented by FSB defector Alexander Litvinenko, who, of course, was poisoned. One of the things that he revealed was that the KGB had been training some of the top leaders of al-Qaeda. People like Ayman al-Zawahiri, described as the mastermind of 9/11 by U.S. officials, was actually trained by the Russian FSB in the late 1990s. This has been a recurring pattern with the Soviet Union where they have gone and found Islamic dupes and turned them into terrorists. They actually pursued this as a deliberate strategy. Now, we know that Russia is one of the worst countries in the world for the practice of journalism. According to the Committee to Protect Journalism, Putin is one of the world's worst predators when it comes to journalists. What kind of friend of America, what kind of friend of liberty, what kind of friend of Christianity would persecute Christians, persecute journalists, engage in false flag attacks, etc.? Now, Putin does claim to be concerned about the mass murder of unborn babies in the form of abortion, and he has taken some very minor efforts to restrict that, and yet Russia still today has among the highest rates of abortion anywhere in the world. And this whole idea that Russia has become a free market economy is self-evidently ludicrous. If you actually look at the way the economy is operated, the big companies are either state-owned outright or the state owns a majority stake in them. Gazprom is, of course, a very obvious example. It's a state-owned energy company which brings in massive amounts of revenue, or at least did until recently, massive amounts of foreign reserves into Russia. So this is the true nature of Russia today. These ideas that Russia has now reformed and that now it's a Christian conservative country that's going to defend Western civilization, again, is self-evidently ludicrous. If you look at the parades that Putin and his comrades have, they march military forces around Moscow and around Red Square, flying communist flags, communist hammers and sickles. They play the Soviet national anthem in the background. I mentioned that Putin was closely associated with the World Economic Forum. In fact, Klaus Schwab himself called him one of his young global leaders. We've got the video of that. Putin's central bank chief was on the board of trustees for the World Economic Forum. And I think ultimately the goal is to bring about what they call convergence between the East and the West. And I think this war in Ukraine that we're seeing right now is going to end up bringing us closer to that goal, even though at the moment it seems like it's getting us further away from that. And so globalists have long understood that conflict is the key to bringing significant changes in. And I'll give you some quotes from globalists in a moment. But you know, one of the things that's become clear in recent decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union is that the United States is moving more in the direction of socialism and communist tyranny, even as it looks like China and Russia are moving slightly closer to a market economy. Now, it is true that the United States is becoming more and more socialistic. That's obvious to anybody who's paying any attention. But the idea that Russia or China are becoming capitalistic, I think, is deception. In fact, the communists have been very good at trying to deceive Western audiences about this idea that they have reformed, that they're now moving toward a free market economy, while all the while they're practicing state capitalism, fascism, where the state still controls every element of the economy. Now, Norman Dodd, he was actually hired by the U.S. Congress in the early 1950s to lead and be the chief investigator for a congressional committee. This congressional committee, the Cox Committee and then the Reese Committee, to investigate tax-exempt foundations. They were asked to find out why these tax-exempt foundations seemed to be so determined to fund things that were undermining America. And what Norman Dodd was told by the head of the Ford Foundation was very interesting. He said that the head of the Ford Foundation, Alan Geither, actually told him that you don't have to investigate us. I'll tell you what we're doing. Our objective here is to so alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. And I think all of this is critical to understanding what's really happening with Russia. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about KGB disinformation specialist Anatoly Golichen. I regard him as one of the most important defectors to ever escape from the Soviet Union. And when he came over to the West, he gave a whole bunch of information to the CIA. The CIA, unfortunately, mostly ignored it. But this information was critical. He made a series of over 200 very specific predictions warning about what he said was going to be happening. He warned of a fraudulent collapse of communism in the Soviet Union. He warned of a phony liberalization in Eastern Europe. And he said that the communists in all of those places would remain in power. And that is exactly what we ended up seeing. We saw a collapse of communism, an alleged collapse of communism. And the communists ended up becoming oligarchs and businessmen and founders of new political parties. So when the Nazis were defeated, we put them all on trial. Many of them were executed. The crimes of the communists were just as bad, if not worse, and yet instead of punishing them, instead of executing them, instead of giving them life in prison, they were simply allowed to rebrand themselves and masquerade as businessmen and things like this. They were able to buy up public assets for pennies on the dollar and then become billionaire oligarchs, all along working toward the same goals. And in a little bit, Christian will talk to you about the giant role of the Communist Party today in Russia and their very close relationship with Putin. Now, at the end of all these predictions that Anatoly Golichen talks about, and you can get the books exposing all this, you've got the Perestroika Deception and New Lies for Old. He explains that the final event to take place out of all this is what he refers to as a second October revolution. So he says the goal was to deceive the Western countries, to get them to disarm, to get them to believe that they had won the Cold War, that everything was fine, everything was going to be great, freedom was victorious, and then by the time all of this was over, they would launch a second October revolution where they would try to impose communism on the entire planet. Here's what he wrote. When the right moment comes, the mask will be dropped, and the Russians, with Chinese help, will seek to impose their system on the West on their own terms as the culmination of a second October revolution. In other words, they're talking about convergence on communist terms. Now, that sounds outrageous to somebody who hasn't closely studied the history, but if you look at the history of the communist movement around the world, what you'll find is that some of the most powerful individuals in the Western world have aided and abetted the spread of communism at every turn. This was true in the case of Cuba, where subversives in our State Department literally installed the Castro regime. The whole story is documented very well in the book, The Fourth Floor, by our ambassador to Cuba, Earl Smith. Fascinating story, tragic story. They painted our ally, Fulgencio Batista, as some sort of crazy dictator. They put an arms embargo on his government. The New York Times, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations there, said that, his name was Herbert Matthews, said that Fidel Castro was a freedom fighter, an anti-communist, Latin America's George Washington, and of course the people who sounded the alarm and warned that he was a communist, including several U.S. ambassadors, were ridiculed and so forth. Similar things happened in China. We had the lying press in America, the propaganda fake media telling us that these were just agrarian reformers, that Chiang Kai-shek, a very close ally of the United States who helped us defeat the Japanese in World War II, that he was some sort of monstrous barbarian who needed to be defeated. Again, they put an arms embargo on his government, even as he was struggling for the life of his government against the communists. And the rest is history. The communists ended up enslaving that great empire, and now they have 1.4 billion slaves under their control. And if you go back even further, this was even true of the Bolshevik Revolution. Anthony Sutton, I consider him to be one of America's most important historians. He explained all of this in his critical book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. What he shows is that American banks, some of the most prominent banks on Wall Street, actually funded the Bolshevik Revolution. They gave Lenin and Trotsky millions of dollars for the purpose of overthrowing the Russian Tsarist government. Now, we don't need to defend the Tsarist government to suggest that American banks probably didn't have any business financing mass-murdering communist revolutionaries, and yet that's exactly what they did. So we have much more going on behind the scenes, and this is true in the current war between Ukraine and Russia. There was an interesting op-ed. It was published in a major German publication. And the writer, Mr. Knigge, says, this was in 2014, "Thank you, Mr. Putin. Your power play does what we couldn't. It revives our two key projects. With your annexation of Crimea, you have thrown a much-needed lifeline to two fundamental Western projects, European integration and the transatlantic partnership." Now, how many people here think Putin is stupid? No hands, yeah. I don't think so either. Putin is not stupid. If Putin threw a lifeline to two globalist projects, submerging the nations of Europe into a European superstate, could that have been an accident? Could he just be such a fool? Could he just be so dumb that he didn't realize he was going to strengthen NATO and strengthen the European Union? I submit to you that that is preposterous. In fact, during the Obama administration, the relationship between the Putin regime and the Obama regime became very clear. Obama actually brought Russian troops onto American soil for the first time. They were doing terrorism drills, jumping out of airplanes together, allegedly looking for terrorists. I actually called the Department of Defense and asked them, what in the world, why are Russian troops partnering with American soldiers here on American soil? And this is what they told me. The Russian soldiers are here as invited guests of the U.S. government. This is part of a formal bilateral exchange program between U.S. and Russia that seeks to develop transparency and promote defense reform. They also added that this is the first time that American and Russian special operations troops have participated in a bilateral exercise. Why would they be doing this? Why would we want to share with the Russians all of the secrets and tactics of our special operators? Somebody should have asked Mr. Obama. The U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency also signed a bunch of agreements with Putin's regime. This was again during the Obama years with his emergencies ministry, and they agreed to cooperate on everything from terror to agriculture to science to the rule of law to health to the environment, energy, nuclear issues, education, culture, media, business, arms control, and much more. In 2014, the Obama administration was working on a secret agreement with the Kremlin to hand over very sensitive tax and financial information to governments all over the world, including Putin's government. Why would you want to do that? And I think the answer is that ultimately the goal is convergence. Now, Henry Kissinger is a key part of this whole story. In early 2012, Putin met up with Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is, of course, one of the leading advocates of a new world order on the planet. He's been an advisor to virtually every president for the last 50 or 60 years. And he was in Moscow in 2012 to meet up with Putin. And Putin's spokesperson said that this was to discuss world affairs with his old friend. It's interesting that Kissinger was old friends with Putin. According to the spokesman, Mr. Peskov, these two had met on numerous occasions. In fact, they had dinner regularly at each other's houses. Putin goes to Henry Kissinger's house in New York. How many people do you think get an invitation to go to Henry Kissinger's house in New York? Here's what the spokesman said. Putin values everyone's point of view, and especially such a wise man as Henry Kissinger. Oh, that was interesting. In Putin's autobiography, he also discusses this special relationship that he's got with Henry Kissinger. And in 2013, Putin's foreign ministry actually gave Henry Kissinger an honorary doctorate in diplomacy. Here's what Putin said when this award was presented. You have not simply been doing diplomatic service or similar activities. You've been a global politician for almost your whole life. You have many friends in Russia, both among our foreign policy veterans and among other people as well, who always pay great attention to your views on how the global political situation will develop. So giving you an honorary doctorate by the Russian Diplomatic Academy makes perfect sense. It does make perfect sense if you understand what's really going on here. Kissinger thanked Putin for being so awesome. He said he's been visiting Russia regularly for over 5 decades. And of course, most of those 5 decades were marked with communist tyranny. And he says, now, Kissinger actually outlined the contemporary strategy for the globalists to build the one world order. He released a book right around that time in the 2014 area. It was called World Order. And if you read this book, he actually gave away the strategy. I want to find the exact quote for you here. But here's what he says in his book. The contemporary quest for world order will require a coherent strategy to establish a concept of order within the various regions, and then to relate these regional orders to one another. And sort through the globalist gobbledygook, and every time they say the word order, just substitute that for government, and that's exactly what they're talking about. We need a regional government. We need to divide the world up into regional governments, and then once these regional governments are all established, we'll figure out ways to relate them to each other. They can either have a conflict or they can cooperate, and then out of that, we'll end up with a one world order. And so where does Putin fit in here? Well, Putin has quietly but very effectively been building what he calls the Eurasian Union. In fact, it's modeled on the European Union, starts with a customs union, and they hope to deepen it and integrate it. And of course, this is the very same plan outlined by Henry Kissinger and other top globalists here in the United States. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the architect of David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission, put it this way at a summit convened by Mikhail Gorbachev. We do not have a new world order. We cannot leap into world government in one quick step. He says, in brief, the precondition for eventual globalization, genuine globalization, is progressive regionalization, because thereby we move toward larger, more stable, more cooperative units. How many people think that people all around the world just woke up one day and said, you know what, we don't need this whole national sovereignty thing. You know, what's this thing with the nation state? Why don't we just all pool our sovereignty and we'll just have a nice world regional government, like a European Union or an African Union, or maybe we'll have a North American Union. We'll give the Latin Americans a union of South American states, right? That's exactly what they're doing. And the idea that people all around the world just woke up and decided they were going to surrender their sovereignty to regional governments is simply preposterous. It's ludicrous. It's never happened before in human history, and of course it would never happen organically. So there is a plan, and there has been a plan for a very long time to make this happen. And even back in the 1960s, they actually outlined this. A member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a subversive globalist organization, explained very clearly in a report called "The World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations" that the way to move from a world of sovereign nation states to a world government controlled by the United Nations was to use war, the threat of war, and crises to encourage changes in attitudes and to encourage a surrender of sovereignty. It's exactly what we're seeing right now. The war in Russia and Ukraine, the main effect that it's having is to cause more and more globalization. The European Union has now announced that they're going to create their own European military to be able to resist Putin. Meanwhile, NATO is expanding. They're bringing in Finland. They're bringing in Sweden. Even Switzerland, which for hundreds of years has been neutral, has now agreed to go along with these sanctions. So the globalization process is really accelerating, and this is actually what Putin has had in mind from the very beginning. I've got some quotes here that he was putting out. He actually was very open about his agenda. In 2011, Putin put out a piece that was published by the Russian propaganda agency Izvestia. The headline was, "A New Integration Project for Eurasia, the Future in the Making." And in this, Putin said, and I'm quoting here, "It took Europe 40 years to move from the European coal and steel community to the full European Union. The establishment of the customs union and the common economic space is proceeding at a much faster pace because we could draw on the experience of the EU and other regional associations." He actually says that this Eurasian regulatory regime that's being imposed on the nations of the former Soviet Union, he says, and I'm quoting here again, is in most cases consistent with European standards. Soon it may be compatible with the regulations in North America, too, as the transatlantic trade and investment partnership continues to simmer. And he actually concluded this op-ed saying, "We suggest a powerful supranational association capable of becoming one of the poles in the modern world and serving as an efficient bridge between Europe and the dynamic Asia-Pacific region. Alongside other key players and regional structures such as the European Union, the United States, China, and APEC, the Eurasian Union will help ensure global sustainable development." This is the very same language that we're hearing from Western globalists. Sustainable development, climate change, on it goes. And then Putin goes on to say that the Eurasian Union will be based on universal integration principles as an essential part of greater Europe, united by shared values of freedom, democracy, and market laws. Are you seeing the convergence yet, folks? The European Union is becoming increasingly totalitarian. In fact, Mikhail Gorbachev once called it the new European Soviet, and what an appropriate name for the European Union. So as Europe becomes more totalitarian, more communistic, it converges with Russia. And eventually, the plan is to merge these all. Putin said this: "Russia and the EU agreed to form a common economic space and coordinate economic regulations without the establishment of supranational structures back in 2003. In line with this idea, we propose setting up a harmonized community of economies stretching from Lisbon to Vladivostok, a free trade zone, and even employing more sophisticated integration patterns. We also propose pursuing coordinated policies in industry, technology, the energy sector, education, science, and also to eventually scrap visas. These proposals have not been left hanging in midair. Our European colleagues are discussing them in detail." Now, all that was kind of put on the back burner for the time being because there's a war going on, and the war is providing an excellent pretext for Ukraine to be merged into one of these unions, for the unions to get their own militaries, and on and on. But the amount of evidence that this is the plan is simply enormous. Okay, this Eurasian Union is going to be one part in the one world order, and this war in Ukraine is a critical part of it. So I don't believe that Putin is opposed to the Western establishment, despite public appearances. In fact, I believe he's working on the same agenda. And many globalists in the West have actually agreed and pointed this out publicly. I'm going to give you a quote here. This is from, at the time, it was the European Council President, Herman van Rompuy, one of the most uninspiring leaders you've ever seen in your life. This is what he said, this again in 2012. "By working together, the EU and Russia can make a decisive contribution to global governance and regional conflict resolution, to global economic governance in the G8 and the G20, and to a broad range of international and regional issues." So just like in 1984, you got to have a bad guy. You got to have the 2 minutes of hate, right? Emmanuel Goldstein. So we all got to be mad, and we got to have a pretext for continuing this, right? What's the justification for the European Union to even exist right now? Well, big bad Russia is invading Ukraine. We need to defend ourselves, right? So the evidence, I think, folks, is overwhelming that Putin is fully on board with this effort to bring humanity under the control of a one world order. It needs to be opposed. He's also been a key player in imposing regional orders in the Caribbean and in Latin America. And that ultimately will be the goal. Now, in 2014, 133 governments met in Bolivia. They actually had a summit. It was the G77 plus China. The 77 is kind of deceiving because they have 134 members now. But the name of the summit was A New World Order to Live Well. And as you read the final document that came out of this, what you'll see is this is basically the Western globalist plan wrapped up in more communistic language. They call for giving a new life to the Charter of the United Nations. They call for the General Assembly to become an emblem of global sovereignty, right? If the UN and the globalist institutions that are being imposed on the planet were truly at odds with what Putin is trying to do, why would all these governments be openly celebrating this? And as you read the document, it's all about climate change and sustainable development and all the rest of it. So folks, that is what's really going on here. And I think we need to understand that that's what's really going on here if we're truly going to understand the conflict. Putin is not our friend. Putin is not a defender of Western civilization. In fact, Putin is a villain who is working in close partnership with the villains in the West to bring humanity under this one-world totalitarian system. Again, he very clearly loves global government. He's been promoting it for a very long time. Looks can be deceiving, but I submit to you that by the time this is all done, the world will look drastically different. After this Ukraine conflict is finished, I think it's going to look like the United States government made the most spectacular own goal in all of geopolitical history. Now, the globalists for the last 10 years have been calling for a shift away from what they describe as the unipolar world order to what they describe as a multipolar world order. And I think that's exactly what we're going to see. We're going to see a weakened U.S. dollar, a controlled demolition of the U.S. economy, a controlled demolition of the U.S. military, which we're watching right now, and Putin and China and the BRICS and the G77 plus China will end up far more powerful, and we may even see that so-called Second October revolution that Anatoly Golichen warned us about. So folks, do not be deceived. Conservatives, do not fall for the propaganda that Putin is your friend. He's not. He never has been. He never will be. Even if he did break with the globalists, he remains a villain. In fact, one of the most dangerous villains on the planet. And I'll leave it there. Thank you folks so much, and I'll give it back to John.